When a gang of men rolled onto a black farmer's land with steel in their boots and arrogance in their eyes, they saw only what they wanted to see: an aging man standing alone in a field, outnumbered, outgunned, and already halfway beaten. To them, he was just another name on a deed, just another soul they could scare into silence. What they didn't see was the soldier beneath the soil-stained shirt, a retired Delta Force commander with the discipline of war etched into his bones and the quiet patience of a man who knew how to end a fight before it began. What began as a show of force would ignite a movement, one that would tear open a hidden network of hate, unite a fractured town, and prove that the roots they tried to rip out ran far deeper than they ever imagined. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The sun slid over the horizon like a slow-burning torch, casting long amber shadows across rows of green that rolled out like a patchwork quilt. The land was quiet in the way sacred places are quiet, not because nothing moved, but because everything had a rhythm. The wind bent the corn stalks just so. The birds called from the power lines in a familiar tune, and the red dirt underfoot, warm and cracked in places, whispered of generations past who had knelt to tend it. Elijah Briggs stood on his porch with a mug of black coffee, eyes scanning the edge of his property where the morning mist still clung to the earth like breath. He was tall and broad-shouldered, not soft like some men grew with age. Time had refined him, hardened him where it counted. His frame still carried the precision of a soldier, and beneath the calm of his dark eyes was something steel-cold and deeply trained. Though he never boasted of what he'd done, folks around town knew him as the man who came back from the military and refused to sell. Most of them had no idea what that really meant. They didn't know he'd served in Delta Force, didn't know how many doors he'd kicked in overseas, how many missions he'd led that never made the news. Eli liked it that way. He had no interest in talking about war. The farm was his piece, passed down from his grandfather, who'd once picked cotton on land he later owned outright. Eli had returned not for rest, but to protect what his family had built with calloused hands and stubborn faith. Down the dirt road that twisted like a lazy snake through the trees, the rumble of a truck broke the stillness. Eli didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed as a white pickup rolled slow past his gate. No plates, blacked-out windows, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong here. Not on a Sunday morning, when the church bells hadn't even rung yet. It didn't stop, just crawled past, tires crackling over gravel, then disappeared back into the trees like a ghost refusing to speak. It was the third time he'd seen that truck in a week. He sipped his coffee and said nothing. Later, while checking the irrigation lines along the east field, he found an old flyer flapping against the fence post. The wind had caught it, wedging it between rusted wires. He peeled it off. The paper was thick, printed in bold red ink with slogans meant to stir the wrong kind of pride. "Preserve the heritage," it read. "Protect the homeland." At the bottom, a burning cross watermark faintly glowed beneath the words. No name, no number. Just an invitation to fear. Eli folded the flyer without a word, slipped it into his back pocket, and kept walking. By the time he circled back to the barn, a familiar face stood waiting. Pastor Roy, an elder from the town's small black congregation, leaned against his truck, hat in hand. "You seen the flyers?" he asked without preamble. Eli nodded. "Found one this morning. They put some on the church doors, too. Taped 'em up like they bowled now." "They are," Eli said plainly. The pastor hesitated, his voice low. "Ain't just you. The Walkers, the Harrisons, even old Miss Liza, all getting these notes. And late-night knocks. Lights shine through windows. Intimidation." Eli's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just looked out toward the fence line. The pastor watched him. "I know you've been quiet since you came back, but you feel what's shifting, don't you?" "I feel it," Eli said. "Same way you feel a storm coming up under your boots before the clouds even show." Pastor Roy exhaled and nodded slowly. "You let me know if you need anything." "I will," Eli said, though he wouldn't. That evening, just before dusk laid its soft hand on the land, Eli walked the perimeter one last time. He stopped at the north field, his favorite stretch, where the soil was deepest and most forgiving. But something was wrong. The gate had been tampered with. One of the posts was bent. Wire snipped. Not torn like an animal would do. Clean. Surgical. Someone had been here. He followed the faint trail, broken grass, disturbed dust, and found hoofprints near the pond. One of his horses, Sweet Bay, was missing. Eli stood there for a long time, the fading light reflecting off his still frame. His mind didn't run wild. It calculated, assessed, processed, not panic, preparation. This wasn't random. This was the opening move, and they had no idea who they were playing with. Morning came again, wrapped in gray clouds, as though the sky itself knew something wasn't right. Eli stepped out onto his porch, as he had every day since returning home, eyes scanning the fields, senses attuned to the slightest shifts. The peaceful rhythm of the farm had changed overnight, now pulsing with subtle danger. He hadn't slept much, spending the dark hours of the night repairing the fence and scouring nearby woods for Sweet Bay. He'd found her at dawn, grazing nervously by the creek, jittery, as though she too knew they were no longer safe. Clara brought him fresh coffee, lingering quietly at his side. "You've got that look again," she said softly, her voice full of gentle worry. "What look is that?" Eli asked, taking the mug and letting the warmth seep into his tired hands. "The look you had every time you came home from deployment," she answered, brushing her fingers over his knuckles. "Like you're calculating your next move." He met her eyes, knowing there was no use hiding the truth. "I've been feeling something coming for a long time. Now it's here." Before Clara could respond, the distant sound of engines echoed down the dirt road, louder than before. Angrier, Eli tensed, placing the mug aside. 3 vehicles crested the hill. A white truck he recognized, flanked by 2 others, their oversized tires crunching gravel and kicking up dust like a cavalry charge. "Go inside," Eli said calmly. Clara hesitated briefly, but obeyed, knowing when Eli meant it. He stepped forward slowly, down the porch steps to stand defiantly in front of the driveway. The trucks skidded to a stop a short distance away, engines rumbling aggressively before cutting off into tense silence. 6 men climbed out of the trucks, their movements deliberate, measured, and intimidating by design. Eli took careful note of each one, from the tall, lean leader dressed in faded denim and a flannel shirt to the youngest at the back, visibly nervous, eyes darting anxiously as though questioning why he'd come. They spread out slowly, forming a half-circle designed to box Eli in and emphasize their control of the space around him. "You must be Briggs," the leader drawled casually, tipping back his worn baseball cap. His cold blue eyes flicked over Eli dismissively, a thin smile playing across his lips, clearly accustomed to exerting dominance without resistance. "Name's Caleb Knox. Heard about you. Heard a lot about you, too," Eli replied evenly, meeting Caleb's gaze steadily and defiantly. "None of it good," Caleb chuckled, a dry, mocking sound, exchanging amused glances with his men, as though Eli were merely entertainment. "Let's not start on the wrong foot now. We're here neighborly-like. Just want to have ourselves a friendly chat. You're on my land," Eli reminded him firmly, his voice steady but edged with steel. "I didn't invite you." Caleb raised his hands in mock surrender, feigning innocence. "Now hold on, Briggs. Me and my boys, we represent folks interested in making sure this community stays, well, how it's supposed to be. Peaceful. Familiar. Folks around here prefer things. Traditional, you understand." "You mean white?" Eli interjected quietly, his voice heavy with restrained anger. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, an ugly glint flickering beneath his carefully composed demeanor. His smile sharpened, losing its earlier pretense of warmth. "You people always jump to conclusions," he sneered softly, deliberately emphasizing the phrase "you people." "We're businessmen. "We've got a generous offer for you, Briggs. More money than you'd probably ever make farming. More than someone like you could ever expect to earn, honestly." Eli clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing dangerously, refusing to rise to the bait. He shook his head slowly, deliberately. "My land isn't for sale, Knox. Not to you, not to anyone. Everything's for sale." Caleb pressed, his voice harder now, tinged unmistakably with derision, "especially for someone like yourself. Truth is, you're lucky we're even offering. You ought to show some gratitude. There's no offer you could make that I'd ever consider." Eli answered steadily, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to be cowed. A heavy silence stretched painfully between them, filled with unspoken threats. Caleb's men shifted restlessly, casting hostile glances toward Eli. Caleb stepped closer, his voice dropping low and filled with venomous contempt. "You think you're special because you've got yourself some land and an attitude?" Caleb whispered harshly, barely controlling his hatred now. "But there's a natural order around here, Briggs, and you and your kind don't belong in it. Accidents happen. Things catch fire. Livestock goes missing. Next thing you know, this dirt patch won't be worth nothing at all. Are you threatening me, Knox?" Eli's voice remained ice-cold, the words measured and sharp as blades. "No threats," Caleb said mockingly, smiling bitterly. "Just friendly advice, from neighbor to neighbor. Think real carefully before you refuse." Eli took a deliberate step forward, close enough that Caleb instinctively retreated, caught momentarily off guard by the quiet, determined force radiating from the man before him. "Let me give you some advice," Eli said calmly, each word deliberately articulated with dangerous intent. "Leave my property, and don't ever come back." "That's your only warning?" Caleb's jaw tightened, his gaze smoldering with barely suppressed rage, but he didn't challenge Eli further. Instead, he snapped his fingers, signaling sharply to his men, who climbed reluctantly back into their trucks, murmuring angrily among themselves. Engines roared to life, a harsh, furious sound, and the vehicles tore out of Eli's driveway, tires kicking up choking clouds of dust as they sped away. Clara reappeared quietly, stepping beside Eli, her eyes wide with concern as she watched the retreating vehicles vanish down the road. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm thinking we need to prepare," Eli answered grimly, his gaze hardening, determined and resolute. "That wasn't just a warning, Clara. It was a declaration of war." Night fell quickly, heavy and dark, blanketing the farm in shadow. Eli didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every creak of wood, every rustle of grass heightened his senses. His mind drifted back to past deployments, the silence before combat, nights spent waiting for enemies who moved in darkness, just like this. A distant crackle snapped him from his thoughts. He rose swiftly, instincts fully alert, recognizing the glow flickering from the barn's direction. Without hesitation, Eli bolted outside, sprinting toward the brightening flames consuming the structure. Heat radiated fiercely, smoke rising in choking waves. The barn was already too far gone to save. Clara ran outside, eyes wide with horror, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders. "Eli, no!" He stopped her gently, holding her back from the inferno. "Stay here. Call the fire department, though I doubt they'll hurry." "Who did this?" she whispered, eyes filling with angry tears. "We know exactly who," Eli answered grimly, staring at the roaring flames, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "And they just made their second move." Eli left Clara at the house, entering the small tool shed untouched by flames. In the shadows at the back, behind tools and farming equipment, was a locked metal cabinet. He opened it carefully, the hinges protesting quietly. Inside lay an old friend, a matte black tactical rifle, meticulously cleaned and maintained. It had been years since he'd touched it, but muscle memory took hold as he loaded it smoothly and steady despite his rage. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the perimeter methodically. Smoke billowed upward, blotting out stars. The peaceful silence of the land he loved had been replaced by the familiar chaos of war. Eli knew this wasn't random intimidation. This was carefully orchestrated terror. They'd made their move. Now it was his turn. He'd been out of this fight for years, but war had found him again. The enemy thought they had chosen an easy target, unaware they'd unleashed something far deadlier than they could possibly imagine. By sunrise, the remains of Eli's barn stood smoldering, twisted beams like blackened ribs against a pale dawn sky. Smoke lingered, drifting slowly across the fields as though reluctant to leave, a grim reminder that peace had fled this land. Eli, rifle in hand, stood at the fence, eyes scanning the horizon. The night had slipped away, carrying any illusion of safety with it. His land was now a battlefield. War had found its way home. Word traveled quickly through the small black community. By mid-morning, vehicles lined Eli's driveway. Neighbors, farmers, and friends stepping cautiously from their trucks, faces heavy with worry and disbelief. Clara stood quietly beside Eli, greeting them softly, eyes reflecting strength and compassion even in crisis. Pastor Roy arrived first, somber and tired-looking, followed closely by old Miss Liza, a small woman whose soft voice often carried the wisdom of generations. Families Eli had known all his life stood in scattered groups, casting anxious glances toward the charred ruins of the barn, whispers hushed as though the violence might return at any moment. "Eli," Pastor Roy began, clasping his hands tightly, "I hoped we'd never see this day again." "It's here," Eli replied evenly, not turning his gaze from the distant tree line, as if anticipating another attack at any second. "I spoke with the sheriff earlier," Roy said hesitantly, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "He called it an accident, Eli. Suggested maybe faulty wiring." Eli's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing at the insult. "We both know better than that." Pastor Roy nodded slowly. "I told him that. He didn't like it. Said we shouldn't stir trouble. Advised me to talk some sense into you and the others." Eli's eyes met Roy's, steel-hard determination behind them. "That's exactly what they want. Our silence. They want us afraid. Quiet. Easier to pick off, one by one." A new voice broke through their conversation. Naomi Walker stepped forward from her car, notebook in hand, eyes sharp and focused. Naomi had grown up here but moved to Atlanta after college, returning now with a reputation for investigative reporting that rattled cages across the South. "I heard what happened," she announced firmly, scanning the gathered crowd. "This isn't isolated. 3 other farms in neighboring counties have faced the same harassment in the past month. Animals missing, vandalism, threatening notes, fires. Exactly like yours, Eli." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, expressions shifting from shock to anger, fear transforming to understanding. Eli nodded at Naomi, respect evident in his eyes. "This isn't intimidation," he said clearly to the community gathered around him. "This is a coordinated attack. They mean to push us out. Take what's ours." "But why now?" Miss Liza asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. "We've always minded our business, done nobody wrong." "Because land has value," Naomi answered gently. "And to them, our ownership of it is a threat. They're betting we're too afraid to fight back." "We shouldn't fight back," old Mr. Harris interjected firmly, his voice thick with authority. At 79, he commanded respect, but his eyes betrayed a lifetime of weary resignation. "Violence breeds more violence. We lived through those times before. We endured, and it passed. This too will pass." A tense silence filled the air, elders nodding solemnly, younger members shaking their heads fiercely, frustration clear in their eyes. Micah Tate stepped forward, fists clenched, eyes burning with youthful fury. At 17, he stood on the threshold between boyhood and manhood, eager and impatient. "Endure? How long should we keep enduring, Mr. Harris? Until there's nothing left of us, or this community." "Micah," Pastor Roy warned softly, sensing the tension. "Respect your elders." Micah's voice softened slightly. though his passion remained unshaken. "I mean, no disrespect, but aren't we tired of this? Of letting fear control our lives?" Voices rose, arguments flared, generations split down the middle, elders pleading caution and peace, youth demanding resistance and dignity. Eli listened carefully, taking it all in, feeling their collective pain and anger deep within his own bones. Finally, Eli raised a hand, quieting the voices with a calm authority that none questioned. His eyes scanned the crowd slowly, thoughtfully. "This land is more than dirt and crops," Eli said firmly, voice resonant, clear. "It's our past, our legacy, everything our ancestors endured, chains, oppression, hate. They endured so we could stand here today. I didn't fight wars overseas just to surrender now. Here, on the land my grandfather worked his life to own." Silence spread quickly through the group, each word carrying a powerful weight. "I understand wanting peace," Eli continued, voice unwavering, "but silence won't protect us anymore. We must prepare to defend ourselves, our homes, our families. Not violence for violence's sake, but strength for survival." Naomi nodded approvingly, scribbling notes as Eli spoke. "What do you suggest?" Pastor Roy asked hesitantly, his tone conflicted, yet hopeful. "Prepare our land defensively. Establish patrols. Organize communication," Eli answered calmly, a general giving orders. "We stand together, not one family alone, but united as one community." "I'll help," Micah volunteered immediately, youthful eagerness lighting his eyes. "So will I," another voice called from the crowd, followed by murmurs of agreement, voices growing louder, confidence spreading quickly among them. Miss Liza stepped forward slowly, her frail form strong with determination. "If we stand together, I believe we can survive this. We have before, we will again." Eli turned to her, warmth and gratitude briefly breaking through his disciplined exterior. "We will." Within hours, Eli had organized watch rotations, patrol schedules, and emergency communications. His farm became the strategic center, neighbors working together, cutting brush away from fences, laying defensive barriers, and preparing for what might come next. Night fell heavily once more, but Eli's land was no longer silent. Small groups moved quietly, patrolling perimeters, keeping watch in shifts. They whispered plans, exchanged encouragements, their collective strength growing stronger by the hour. Clara handed out warm meals, her presence calming, a quiet pillar of support. Standing watch at the fence line, rifle ready, Eli felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. Pride at their courage, sorrow that such courage was needed again. The lines had been drawn. The peace he once knew was lost, but in its place, something powerful had risen. Unity, resilience, resistance, and when trouble came again, they'd be ready. The next morning broke clear, the sun rising hot and sharp over Eli's land, painting golden streaks across freshly prepared defenses. Eli had barely slept, his mind still on high alert from the previous night's patrols and preparations. Neighbors had begun arriving early again, quietly reinforcing fence lines, setting tripwires hidden in tall grass, and positioning vehicles strategically to control access points. His farm had become more than a home. It had become a fortress, a community standing shoulder to shoulder. As midday approached, the stillness shattered. In the distance, the low rumble of engines drew closer, aggressive and unrelenting. Eli stood immediately, signaling Micah and several other young men into position near the main gate. Pastor Roy, Uncle Har, and several elders stood cautiously behind, watching, praying quietly, while Eli moved quickly, rifle slung deliberately across his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. 3 trucks barreled onto the property, tires tearing through the dirt, leaving trails of thick, choking dust. Each vehicle was full, masked men hanging out windows, jeering loudly, faces obscured beneath dark cloths, only their hateful eyes visible. The vehicles skidded to a halt in front of Eli's reinforced gate, engines growling like angry animals, clearly intending intimidation. Eli stepped forward calmly, but deliberately, stopping directly in their path, unafraid, eyes coolly assessing their every move. Caleb Knox stepped from the lead truck, pulling down his mask slightly, a twisted smile curving his lips. Behind him, two men dragged a crudely built wooden cross, tossing it onto the dirt as if claiming territory. "Thought we made ourselves clear, Briggs," Caleb shouted, voice full of venom. "Maybe you folks don't understand subtlety." "You made your point clear enough," Eli answered, voice firm, loud enough to carry, eyes locked coldly on Caleb's face. "And we answered clearly. This land isn't yours. Never was, never will be." Caleb laughed bitterly, glancing toward his men, his confidence bolstered by their numbers. "See, that's where you're wrong. It always belonged to us. You're just caretakers, temporary. And time's up." Eli's expression didn't change. His voice remained steady, calm, but steely. "This is your last chance, Knox. Leave peacefully, and don't come back." Caleb shook his head slowly, drawing a pistol and pointing it casually, almost mockingly, toward Eli's feet. "You really think you scare us? A washed-up old farmer? You don't know who you're dealing with." Eli replied softly, shifting his stance imperceptibly, feet grounded, muscles tensed, ready to react. "Oh, I think we do," Caleb sneered, signaling his men forward. The masked men surged forward suddenly, intending to overwhelm Eli and the others quickly. But Eli raised his hand swiftly, a silent signal. Instantly, the hidden wires snapped taut, causing attackers to stumble and fall heavily into concealed trenches, their shouts of confusion mingling with Caleb's furious curses. Before the attackers could recover, Eli moved. His movements were precise, swift, perfectly controlled, a lifetime of Delta Force training honed to a deadly efficiency. The first man swung wildly, a wooden club aimed recklessly. Eli sidestepped effortlessly, gripping the attacker's wrist, twisting it sharply until the man cried out, weapon dropping uselessly to the dirt. A quick shove sent him sprawling back, stunned and disarmed. Two more approached together, snarling viciously beneath their masks. Eli reacted instantly, dodging one's crude punch, grasping him by the collar, using momentum to send him crashing into his companion, both collapsing heavily onto the ground, tangled and humiliated. "Take your men and leave," Eli warned again, voice cold, authoritative, watching Caleb closely as others struggled to regain footing. Caleb spat bitterly onto the ground. "You'll regret this." Another wave charged, weapons raised, shouting obscenities, emboldened by rage and wounded pride. Eli moved with calculated calm, stepping smoothly into their blind spots, deflecting blows with minimal effort, redirecting attackers' momentum to leave them stumbling, embarrassed, and disoriented. Each humiliation chipped away at their bravado, sowing doubt, frustration, and fear. Micah and the others stood back, astonished and inspired, watching Eli, a force of calm amidst chaos, methodically dismantling the attacker's aggression without firing a single shot. "Is this the best you've got, Knox?" Eli challenged loudly, eyes blazing with controlled fury. "Men who stumble over their own hatred?" Caleb flushed crimson, rage visibly trembling in his clenched fists. "This isn't over, Briggs." "Oh, it is," Eli replied, steady and unyielding. "Right now." Eli stepped forward boldly, directly toward Caleb, who instinctively raised his weapon defensively. But Eli never hesitated, approaching fearlessly until mere inches separated them. Caleb's eyes widened briefly, uncertainty cracking through arrogance. "You shoot me now, and I guarantee you won't leave here alive," Eli warned quietly, voice low, dangerously calm. "I don't want bloodshed, Knox, but threaten my family, my community again, I'll stop being polite." Caleb's hand twitched on the pistol, a subtle tremor betraying the chaos behind his eyes. He hadn't expected this. A man who didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't beg for mercy like others had. Around them, The fallen gang members groaned on the ground, humiliated and winded, their weapons scattered uselessly in the dirt. The Red Thorns were not used to being resisted, and certainly not by a man who stood alone, without backup, without fear. But Caleb Knox wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. He couldn't. Not after Eli had dismantled half his men without firing a shot. With a sudden, vicious growl, Caleb dropped the pistol and lunged forward, shoulder lowered, aiming to drive Eli into the dirt by brute force. Eli didn't move. Not yet. At the last possible second, Eli pivoted hard on his back foot, redirecting Caleb's full momentum with a sidestep. Caleb went off balance, stumbling past, but managed to recover quickly, spinning around, his fist already swinging wide. It connected, a hard, clumsy blow across Eli's jaw that jerked his head to the side. Micah gasped, stepping forward instinctively, but Clara's hand gripped his shoulder. "Let him fight," she said softly. Eli didn't fall. Instead, he turned back slowly, the side of his mouth bloodied, but his eyes colder now, sharper. "That was your one," Eli muttered, voice low. He moved forward like a machine snapping into gear, smooth, controlled, brutal. His left hand shot out, palm open, catching Caleb's throat with the heel of his hand and driving him back. Caleb choked, stumbling, arms flailing. Eli followed, stepping into him with calculated force, delivering a sharp elbow to the ribs, then a sweeping leg kick that dropped Caleb hard to one knee. Before Eli could press the advantage, one of the Red Thorns came up behind him with a metal pipe. Clara shouted, but Eli spun with lightning reflexes, catching the attacker mid-swing. He grabbed the pipe mid-air, twisting it violently from the man's grip, then flipped it underhanded and slammed the butt of it into the man's sternum. The attacker dropped, gasping, to the ground, winded and unable to rise. But the moment's distraction gave Caleb a window. He surged back to his feet and tackled Eli from behind, slamming both of them into the dirt with a grunt. Dust exploded into the air. The crowd watching cried out, some stepping forward, others too stunned to move. Caleb was strong, wild. He rained fists down, hammering Eli's shoulders and ribs with reckless fury. Eli grunted, blocking as many strikes as he could, but one caught his cheekbone hard, splitting the skin. Blood dripped freely now, but Eli's mind remained focused. He absorbed one more hit, then moved fast, striking upward with a powerful headbutt that dazed Caleb enough to shift their positions. Eli reversed their momentum, flipping Caleb off him with a practiced sweep of his leg and rolling quickly to straddle him. Elbows, fists, and sharp jabs rained down with methodical precision, each one meant to debilitate, not kill. Caleb screamed and bucked violently, his face bloody now, eyes swelling shut. But Eli didn't stop until he saw the fight draining from the man's limbs. Still breathing heavy, Eli stood, chest heaving, sweat and blood painting his face. His eyes scanned the field, but it wasn't over. 3 more men rushed him at once, one wielding a bat, another with a length of chain, the third with bare fists and wild eyes. Micah and the other young men started forward, but again Eli raised a hand, motioning them back. "I've got it," he barked. The one with the bat swung first. A wild horizontal slash meant to break ribs. Eli ducked low, stepped inside the arc of the swing, and slammed his knee into the man's gut. As the bat dropped, Eli snatched it mid-fall and turned, swinging upward in a short arc that cracked against the second attacker's wrist, disarming the chain and sending it flying. The third man lunged, fists flying in a windmill fury, but Eli absorbed the first few glancing blows, then struck with military precision. A palm strike to the nose, a hook to the side of the jaw, and a finishing shove that sent the man backward into the dust. Panting now, bruised, and bleeding from 2 spots on his face, Eli stood alone in the silence that followed. The Red Thorns lay sprawled around him, groaning, broken, their arrogance shattered on the field they thought they could claim. Micah stepped forward finally, eyes wide with pride and awe. They came ready to burn us down, Micah said, voice hoarse. Eli wiped the blood from his lip and nodded slowly. And they left in pieces. Caleb struggled to rise, coughing blood, crawling toward his gun like a dog chasing its last chance. Eli walked slowly over and kicked the weapon away, then leaned down close. "You bring this violence to my door again," Eli said coldly, "and I won't just humiliate you. I'll bury this whole rotten thing you call a movement." Caleb's breath rasped, but he didn't reply. His face was swollen, his pride broken. His men lay behind him, scattered and silent. Eli straightened slowly, feeling the deep, dull ache of battle in his muscles, the adrenaline ebbing away as reality flooded back. He glanced around the field, now silent except for the distant groans of defeated men and the harsh breathing of the neighbors who'd witnessed something they would never forget. Micah stood nearby, still stunned and wide-eyed with admiration, barely able to hide his excitement and pride. "We did it," the boy murmured softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We beat 'em back. Nobody ever beat 'em before." Eli turned toward Micah, placing a firm hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We're not done yet, Micah. This was just one battle, not the whole war." Before Micah could reply, the low hum of an approaching engine broke the fragile silence. Eyes turned, cautious again, as Sheriff Gentry Cobb's patrol car rolled slowly down the driveway, tires crunching deliberately on the gravel like a slow, inevitable threat. The sheriff stepped out casually, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, aviators reflecting the glare of the midday sun. His expression was unreadable beneath that mirrored glass, a careful mask of authority hiding secrets Eli had long suspected. Cobb took his time surveying the scene, studying each fallen member of the Red Thorns with detached interest, before finally turning his attention to Eli. "You've had yourself quite a morning, Briggs," Cobb remarked dryly, his voice thick with forced casualness. He removed his sunglasses slowly, folding them deliberately into his shirt pocket. "I'd appreciate it if you'd explain exactly what happened here." Eli didn't blink, didn't shift his stance. "You know exactly what happened here, Sheriff. You just arrived late enough to miss the worst of it." Sheriff Cobb's jaw tightened slightly, annoyance flickering briefly in his eyes. He moved closer, ignoring Micah and the others who stood protectively around Eli. Cobb's gaze settled on Eli's injuries, noting the blood and bruises with mild satisfaction. "You know," Cobb said, lowering his voice, conspiratorial but clearly threatening, "a smarter man might see this as an opportunity to make peace. We've got enough trouble around here without you stirring the pot." "I didn't stir anything," Eli responded coldly. "Your friends brought violence to my land, my community. You planning on arresting them or just lecturing me?" Cobb smirked faintly, glancing dismissively toward the scattered gang members now climbing weakly into their trucks, retreating quietly with heads bowed. "Misunderstanding, Briggs. Tempers flare. Mistakes get made. I'm sure nobody meant any permanent harm." Micah's eyes widened, his fists clenching at his sides. Eli caught the young man's movement and placed a calming hand back on his shoulder, warning him silently to hold his anger for now. "You calling this a misunderstanding?" Eli asked, voice sharp and cutting. "You saw that cross they brought, Sheriff. You're really going to pretend you don't understand exactly what's happening here?" Cobb's eyes narrowed slightly, irritation showing more clearly. "Careful now, Eli. Accusations without proof get dangerous fast. Best to let this go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The threat hung heavy in the air, unspoken but clear as daylight. Eli stepped closer, deliberately invading the sheriff's personal space, eyes blazing quietly. Cobb stiffened instinctively, hand edging toward the holster at his hip. "Harder?" Eli echoed softly, dangerously. "You think this could possibly get harder?" "They came to burn us down, Sheriff. Where were you when they lit up my barn? Where were you when they threatened families in our own community? You're not here to protect us. You're here to keep us quiet. But I'm done being quiet." Cobb stared back fiercely, resentment bubbling beneath his carefully controlled expression. "Watch yourself, Briggs. You've got people depending on you. You push too far, It's them who'll pay the price. You threatening my community now, Sheriff? Eli's voice was low, icy, carrying clearly to everyone present. No, Cobb answered calmly, reining himself in with practiced control, stepping back slowly toward his patrol car. I'm advising caution, for your sake. And theirs. Be smart, Eli. Let this settle quietly. Because next time, I might not be around to defuse things. Cobb placed his sunglasses back on, climbing into his car without another word, slamming the door and driving away with calculated indifference. The dust settled slowly behind him, leaving Eli and the others standing quietly, stunned by the blatant threat from a man sworn to protect them. Micah finally exhaled shakily, eyes still wide, voice trembling slightly with anger and frustration. We can't just let him do this, Eli. He's as bad as they are. Eli nodded slowly, expression hardening with resolve. We're not letting anything go, but we're not playing their game either. If Cobb won't help us, we find another way. We don't beg for protection. We build our own. He turned back toward the community gathered near him, watching with quiet hope and determination, their eyes reflecting newfound strength and resolve. From now on, we patrol in shifts, around the clock. We document everything that happens, every threat, every attack, every face, every vehicle. Naomi's already working on getting our story out. But until then, we protect each other. Heads nodded slowly, murmurs of agreement spreading quietly but steadily. Pastor Roy stepped forward, gently laying a hand on Eli's shoulder. We trust you, Eli, Roy said quietly. If you say stand, we stand. Eli glanced back gratefully, feeling the immense weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, familiar, yet heavier now than any combat zone he'd faced overseas. Clara moved quietly beside Eli, gently threading her fingers through his, squeezing softly. They'll come back stronger, won't they? Eli sighed softly, pulling her closer, grounding himself in her quiet strength. Yes, but this time, we'll be ready. And the next time they try, we won't be alone. Everyone here is ready to stand. As afternoon shadows lengthened over Eli's battered fields, quiet determination settled deeply over the community. Preparations resumed immediately. Fortifications rebuilt, patrols reorganized, strategies planned with renewed intensity. War had arrived openly now, disguised as hate, greed, and intimidation. But Eli Briggs knew battles. He knew sacrifice, courage, and what it took to lead in times of uncertainty. And if this was war, then Eli would lead his community through it, to victory, peace, and the justice they all deserved. In the days following Sheriff Cobb's thinly veiled warning, Eli knew better than to trust silence. A lull didn't mean peace. It meant the enemy was regrouping, waiting, preparing their next move. The Red Thorns had been humiliated, their pride shattered, and Eli knew enough about war to understand that wounded pride was a dangerous fuel for retaliation. Within a week, the calm erupted into chaos. It began subtly: cut fences, damaged irrigation lines, tire slashes on parked vehicles, but soon escalated dramatically. The enemy struck with calculated cruelty. Intent on breaking spirits, they scattered nails in driveways, poisoned livestock feed, and shattered windows in the dead of night. Worse still, reports filtered in from neighbors about masked figures intimidating children walking home from school, shouting threats and slurs from passing trucks. Eli's community found themselves under siege, their quiet rural life shattered by aggression, designed to terrorize and divide them. Naomi Walker diligently documented each act, her voice growing louder through her stories. But local authorities, led by Cobb's deliberate neglect, remained deafeningly silent. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, the community was being methodically dismantled piece by piece. Determined not to let despair gain a foothold, Eli focused on turning his farm into a haven. Each morning began early, with Eli leading groups of neighbors through defensive training, lessons drawn directly from his military past. Teens like Micah eagerly absorbed every technique, learning to patrol quietly, spot subtle signs of intrusion, and how to organize and communicate effectively under pressure. Men and women alike learned self-defense, building confidence in their ability to protect their homes and families. "We're not soldiers," Micah remarked breathlessly after one intense training session, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No, you're not," Eli responded firmly, eyes scanning the tired yet determined faces around him. "But you're warriors, because you've chosen to defend something worth fighting for. Warriors fight smarter, not just harder." During a twilight patrol, Eli found Micah waiting anxiously by the fence line, tension tight in the young man's jaw. Micah's eyes glittered with anger and frustration, fingers gripping the fence so tightly they trembled. "They scared my little sister yesterday," Micah whispered bitterly, voice thick with emotion. "Chased her home, shouted things I can't repeat." "How do we fight hate like that, Eli?" Eli stood beside him silently for a moment, the weight of Micah's pain settling heavily on his own heart. Finally, he placed a steady hand on Micah's shoulder, meeting his gaze evenly. "By never letting them make us like them," Eli replied quietly. "They fight with cruelty, fear, intimidation. We fight with strength, discipline, and unity. That's why we'll win." Micah drew a deep breath, steadying himself, resolve returning to his young eyes. "I'm ready, Eli. Whatever it takes." Eli nodded solemnly, pride clear in his voice. "I know." At night, the farm took on the disciplined atmosphere of a military camp. Eli established defensive rotations. Each group assigned specific watch shifts and routes. Neighbors exchanged walkie-talkies, carefully planned signals for trouble, and secured all entry points with motion-triggered lights and alarms. Nothing was left to chance. Clara quietly maintained morale, tirelessly cooking meals, offering reassuring words, providing the gentle encouragement the community needed. Her quiet strength reinforced Eli's presence, a silent partnership that kept the community rooted and focused. One afternoon, while reinforcing the perimeter fences, Pastor Roy paused to watch Eli work, his face thoughtful and troubled. "I prayed we'd never see this kind of hatred again," Roy admitted softly, voice heavy. "Thought we buried this evil years ago." Eli straightened slowly, dusting off his hands. "Hatred doesn't die, Pastor. It sleeps until someone wakes it again, but so does courage, so does hope." "That's what they didn't count on." Roy sighed deeply, eyes weary but determined. "Still, how much more can our people take? Families are tired. The children are scared." "I know," Eli responded solemnly. "But if we break now, we lose forever. If we hold, even when we're tired, we'll have a future worth fighting for." As if punctuating Eli's point, shouting suddenly erupted from the far edge of the property. Eli and Roy raced toward the sound, hearts pounding with dread. They found two masked men fleeing quickly into the brush, having dropped cans of gasoline near a tool shed. Micah and two other teenagers stood defiantly, weapons raised defensively, expressions determined and alert. "They tried to set fire again," Micah announced breathlessly, eyes wild but focused. Eli surveyed the scene quickly, pride swelling at their courage. "You did well, Micah." Perfect response. Micah smiled briefly, adrenaline still pulsing through him. "We learned from you." By nightfall, news of the attempted sabotage spread, only deepening Eli's resolve. They gathered in Eli's barn, the new temporary hub for defense strategy, and Eli addressed the weary yet fiercely determined faces around him. "They're testing us," Eli announced clearly, voice strong and authoritative, "hoping we'll break. Every attack is proof they're desperate. This violence is their weakness, not their strength." "What if it never stops?" someone asked from the back, voice wavering slightly with uncertainty. "It stops when we stop it," Eli replied firmly. "Together, unified. They expect weakness. We'll show them strength. They expect silence. We'll give them defiance. We outlast their hate, because this land, our lives, our community, these things aren't negotiable." Quiet murmurs of agreement rippled around the barn, shoulders straightening, eyes brightening with renewed determination. Eli raised his voice again, firm but hopeful. Tomorrow, we rebuild stronger, reinforce every fence, every gate, every home. Tonight, we protect each other. No one stands alone anymore. No one. As neighbors dispersed to their patrols and homes, Clara lingered beside Eli, her hand slipping into his gently, offering silent strength. Do you think they'll listen now? Eli nodded slowly, squeezing her hand gently. They'll have to. We're past talking. From now on, we speak through our actions. He glanced toward the horizon, eyes steady with resolve. The community he loved had faced unspeakable threats, endured unimaginable cruelty, yet they stood now stronger than before, united by adversity, bound by hope. War had arrived at their doorstep, but Eli Briggs knew wars weren't won by force alone. Wars were won through resilience, courage, and unity, and in this fight, he intended to leave no one behind. The fields had begun to bloom again, but the land held its breath. Each morning brought with it the sound of metal hammering against wood, footsteps moving in shifts, radios crackling with updates from patrols. Eli's farm had become the pulse of the entire black community, strong, unwavering, but now shadowed with suspicion. He could feel it underfoot, buried in the roots of the land like something poisonous spreading unseen. Naomi arrived mid-morning, face flushed and jaw set, eyes sharper than he'd ever seen them. "We need to talk," she said, pulling him aside near the chicken coop where Eli had been repairing a section of fencing. He set down his hammer and followed her to the edge of the barn, where she pulled a thick manila folder from her satchel. The papers inside were worn, some creased, others bearing water stains. But what caught Eli's eye was the single word stamped in red ink across the corner of the first document. Filed. "These are forged," Naomi said, flipping through the pages quickly. "Land deeds. They're transferring property titles of black-owned farms, ours, to shell companies." Eli's face darkened as she continued. "Some are properties we've lived on for generations, but if you trace the paperwork, there's a pattern. Everything's been rerouted through a phony holding company out of state, but the signatures, they don't match." Eli took the folder from her hands and examined the documents in silence, his fingers tightening around the edges. One name appeared repeatedly among the signatures: Cobb Gentry. "The sheriff?" Eli asked, low and dangerous. Naomi nodded. "He's not just looking the other way. He's helping them rewrite ownership right from under us. This isn't just harassment anymore, Eli. It's theft. Legal theft." Eli breathed slowly, his chest rising with fury. "Why now?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Naomi hesitated. "Because the county just approved funding for a commercial development project. Highway expansion, industrial center, new infrastructure. All of it set to cut straight through this land. Your land, our land." Eli closed the folder gently, rage simmering beneath his calm expression. "So they're trying to clean us out before anyone notices. And the red thorns are their cover," Naomi added. "They do the dirty work. Cobb and his friends in the courthouse handle the rest." Eli didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence was thunder. That afternoon, Micah and 3 other teens took their usual patrol through the southern fields. A flat stretch bordered by trees and a dry stream bed. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting gold across the high grass and stirring shadows among the pines. Spirits were high. Micah laughed, tossing a rock across the field toward the stream, when suddenly a low click snapped through the air. "Stop!" he yelled, raising a clenched fist as the others froze in place. From beneath the weeds, a tripwire lay taut. But it was already too late. A deafening pop shattered the silence, followed by 2 more. Not gunfire, no flash, but the sound of smoke canisters erupting violently, billowing thick gray clouds that filled the air and stung their eyes. The boys panicked, scattering in different directions, coughing and shouting blindly through the haze. Footsteps thundered from the tree line, masked men armed with bats and chains, emerging like phantoms from the smoke. Micah ducked instinctively, narrowly dodging a swing meant to split his skull. He dropped to the ground and rolled, lashing out with his boot, catching the attacker in the shin. He scrambled to his feet, eyes burning, ears ringing, searching for the others through the suffocating fog. Another shadow loomed to his right. He raised his arm, but the bat came down hard, slamming into his forearm and sending a jolt of pain through his body. He cried out, stumbling backward, defenseless. Then a blur crashed into the attacker from the side. Eli. He moved like a storm. Fast, brutal, purposeful. He grabbed the bat mid-swing and twisted it from the man's grip before driving his elbow into the man's throat, dropping him soundlessly. Another figure rushed from behind. Eli turned, catching the man's wrist and throwing him over his shoulder in a sweeping arc that landed hard. "Micah, get out of here!" Eli barked, eyes blazing as he moved like a predator, cutting through the smoke with precision. But Micah didn't run. He grabbed a fallen piece of lumber and swung it into a third attacker, knocking him off his feet. Eli took notice, just briefly, but it was enough for a fourth man to land a blow square to Eli's ribs. He staggered. The wind knocked from his lungs, but stayed upright. Blood ran down his side now, where a nail from the weapon had torn skin. He turned and grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, slamming him into a tree with enough force to leave a dent. The fight slowed, attackers retreating into the fog as they realized this wasn't going to end the way they'd hoped. Eli stood in the center of the smoke field, chest heaving, blood soaking through his shirt. Micah knelt beside one of the others, helping him breathe. When the smoke finally cleared, all 4 teens were alive. Bruised, shaken, but alive. Eli, limping slightly, helped carry one of the injured boys toward the truck they'd hidden near the ridge. The field was still humming with pain, smoke curling from the ruptured canisters like ghosts refusing to leave. Blood speckled the grass. Micah's knuckles were raw, his breath ragged. One of the boys was bleeding from the head, another clutching his ankle. Eli moved among them, steadying, checking pulses, clearing their vision one by one. Then he froze. The fifth attacker, the one he'd slammed into the tree, was gone. "Eyes up!" Eli growled, raising a hand. "One of them's still here." Micah snapped to attention, grabbing a branch thick enough to swing. The teens looked around, gasping, their injuries forgotten as adrenaline surged again. Then, from behind the rusted irrigation pump, movement. Eli stepped forward. "Stay behind me." A rustle, a boot scuff on dry dirt, and the attacker lunged. But Eli had baited him. The man didn't see the shovel until it swung up like a hammer, catching him square in the jaw with the flat of the steel. He dropped like a felled log. Eli stood over him for a moment, shoulders rising and falling. The boys behind him stared, not just with awe now, but with something deeper, respect mixed with fear. Not fear of Eli, but fear of the line he'd just crossed without hesitation, a line they all now knew existed, waiting if things went further. Micah said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the bloodied shovel in Eli's hands. Then a new sound cracked the tension, a whistle, not distant, not friendly, another signal. Eli's eyes snapped to the tree line. "Move!" he barked. "Back to the truck, now!" They scrambled across the field, supporting one another, Eli bringing up the rear. Another smoke bomb rolled from the brush, hissing violently as it exploded near their path, cutting them off. Eli pivoted immediately, adjusting course, calculating. They reached the truck, just as 2 more attackers appeared at the ridge, these 2 armed not with bats or chains, but with hunting rifles, slung casually over their shoulders, as if they were out on a deer run. "Cover!" Eli shouted, throwing open the passenger door and pulling one of the boys behind it. Micah dragged the others to the opposite side, shielding them with the wheel wells. The truck offered little in terms of real protection, but Eli knew these men. He could see the hesitation in their posture, the indecision in their movements. They hadn't expected this much resistance, hadn't expected someone trained to survive worse. Eli crouched low, hands moving quickly as he opened the small lockbox beneath the driver's seat. A Sig Sauer handgun. Legal. Loaded. He slid the magazine out, checked it, reloaded in one smooth motion. He stood. Micah shouted after him, "Eli, don't!" But Eli didn't aim. He walked forward, sidearm lowered, body squared in full view of the two men aiming down at him. "You take that shot!" he shouted up the hill, voice slicing through the wind. "And you better pray I don't walk away." The gunman flinched. One raised his rifle. The other hesitated. "I know who you are," Eli called again, louder. "You're not ghosts. You're cowards in camo. I've seen men like you in every corner of the world, and I buried them in every one." The one on the left took a step back. The other lowered his rifle. Eli kept moving forward, slow and measured. "You tell Caleb Knox that he's running out of time. And next time you send boys with guns after children, I won't stop at scare tactics. I will end this." The gunman turned and fled, vanishing into the woods. No shots fired. Eli didn't lower the pistol until he could no longer hear their retreat. When he returned to the truck, Micah was helping the injured boy onto the seat, shaking his head. "They had rifles," Micah said hoarsely. "They could have, they didn't," Eli said quietly, "because they're not soldiers. They play tough, but they're afraid of what they don't understand." Micah turned, brow furrowed. "And what exactly are you, Eli?" There was no anger in the question, just confusion, curiosity, awe. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the woods, blood still drying on his side, body aching. "I'm a man who's done things I don't talk about," he said finally. "But every skill I learned, every war I survived, I'm using it now, not to kill, but to protect." Micah nodded slowly. "Then teach us more, all of it." Eli studied the boy's face. Not the same impulsive teen he'd met weeks ago. Now there was steel in him. Pain, too. The kind of pain that forges resolve. "I will," Eli said, gripping his shoulder. "But not so you can fight like me." "Why then?" "So you don't have to." They drove back in silence. The truck's cab smelled like sweat, iron and smoke. One boy cried softly, the rush wearing off. The others sat quiet, staring out the windows at a world that felt different now. Smaller, sharper, meaner. Eli felt it too. This wasn't just hate anymore. It was strategy. It was a campaign. Caleb Knox was escalating. And if he was escalating, that meant he was desperate. Back at the farm, Clara rushed out with towels and water. Neighbors gathered, voices rising with questions and anger. "They used rifles," Eli said simply. "They tried to hurt the kids. They're not just trying to scare us now. They want blood." Naomi approached, face grim. "Then we hit back where it counts." "I already started," Eli said. She handed him a photograph. It was a snapshot of Caleb and Sheriff Cobb, standing in front of a courthouse, shaking hands. "They're tied together," Naomi said, "and they're running out of places to hide." Eli looked at the photo, then at his wounded community. The time for warnings had passed. It was time to finish this. The moon rose over the ridge, high and watchful, casting a pale silver sheen across Eli's land. Its light fell on carefully laid paths, reinforced fences, and the quiet silhouettes of neighbors taking their posts, their movements practiced and purposeful. The stillness that spread across the community that night was not the hush of peace, but the breath held before the storm. Something in the air had shifted, tighter, sharper, and Eli felt it settle in his bones like a familiar weight he hadn't carried in years. He moved along the outer perimeter just before midnight, checking the motion detectors tucked beneath the brush, adjusting tripwires that fed into floodlights and noise alarms. Every detail had been accounted for. This was no longer a patchwork defense. This was a coordinated operation, one that reflected not only Eli's military training, but the spirit of a people refusing to be moved. From the church steeple across the fields, a single flash of light blinked 3 times, Naomi's signal from the lookout. The red thorns were on the move. Eli pressed his walkie. Positions. It's tonight. The voice that came back was clear and confident. Micah, we're ready. And they were. The red thorns came from all directions, creeping through the woods and along the irrigation ditches, clothed in black and armed with bats, clubs, and Molotovs. They had split into teams this time, targeting multiple homes at once, hoping to stretch the defenders thin and overwhelm them through speed and chaos. But they had underestimated the mind behind the countermeasures. The first wave breached the rear fence of the Taylor property. They moved fast, sprinting toward the barn, their boots pounding the dirt, until a flare snapped to life overhead, casting the field in sudden blinding white. A cascade of tin cans dropped from the eaves, clattering against steel drums below, setting off a chain reaction of sound that echoed like gunfire. Before the attackers could regroup, 2 young defenders emerged from behind hay bales, swinging with homemade staffs. The red thorns stumbled, disoriented by light and noise, their charge collapsing before it even reached the front door. Meanwhile, to the east, a second group crept along the orchard rows toward Miss Liza's house. They moved in silence, emboldened by the cover of darkness, until one of them tripped a wire hidden in the grass. A thick cloud of powdered chalk and cayenne pepper exploded into the air, choking them instantly, filling their eyes with tears and their lungs with fire. The screams that followed were not of rage, but of confusion and pain. By the time Eli arrived at the scene, they were already on their knees, coughing and clawing at their faces. He moved past them without pity, pressing deeper into the heart of the attack. Across the ridge, the gang's largest unit had reached the center of the community, the stretch of homes closest to the fields, where families with children had taken shelter. They advanced boldly, expecting soft targets. Instead, they walked straight into a wall of resistance. Eli's command post, an old tractor garage now converted into a fortress, erupted with coordinated action. Teens with radios barked directions from rooftops, while adults hidden behind overturned hay carts blocked paths and funneled attackers into choke points. Every step the red thorns took forward was met with resistance not born of hatred, but of preparation. Eli emerged from the shadows like something carved from stone. He didn't yell or flinch. He moved fast and low, disarming one man with a sharp wrist twist, then sweeping the legs out from another who came at him swinging a 2x4. His movements were efficient. Nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. This was combat as he'd learned it. Clean, focused, without the need for theatrics. Caleb Knox watched from a distance, crouched behind the wheel well of a pickup truck, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Through the chaos, he tracked Eli's movement, not like a farmer defending his land, but like a soldier trained in the art of war. There was precision in the way Eli handled himself, an ease in the violence that Caleb didn't understand, but suddenly feared. He turned to one of his men. He's military. Has to be. The way he moves, it's not normal. The man looked confused. What does that matter? He's just one man. Caleb didn't answer. His eyes narrowed as Eli took down 2 more of his men without breaking stride. In that moment, the truth settled in Caleb's gut like a stone. They had started a war with someone who had fought real ones and survived. By the end of the attack, several red thorns were down, most not seriously injured, but all subdued with humiliating efficiency. The rest had retreated into the woods, dragging their wounded and leaving behind those too dazed to run. When the smoke cleared and the shouting died, the community stood tall. Bloodied, yes. Shaken, absolutely. But still here. Still standing. Eli gathered the captured attackers in the center of the field, tying their hands with heavy rope and having them sit where everyone could see. Pastor Roy, Clara, Naomi, and others circled in, watching. One of the captured men, a pale, wiry youth with a bleeding lip, refused to meet Eli's eyes. "What's your name?" Eli asked, voice steady. The man didn't answer. Eli crouched down, not raising his voice, just speaking low enough for only the captured men to hear. "You came here to hurt us, to burn us out, but we're still here. You can end this tonight by telling the truth." Still, silence. Then another man spoke. Older, thicker in the shoulders, breathing heavily through cracked lips. This wasn't about land. Eli turned to him slowly. "What was it about?" The man licked his lips, hesitant, then dropped his head. "They said this was about cleansing, about taking it all back. The land, the town, everything. They said your people were parasites, that you were erasing their history. They wanted to erase you first." Naomi, standing just behind Eli, slowly lifted her camera and pressed record. She didn't speak. Eli stared at the man. "Who gave the orders?" The man hesitated, then whispered one name, Caleb Knox. "And?" The man swallowed hard. "He said the sheriff was in on it. Said as long as Cobb kept the paperwork clean and the reports quiet, we could keep pushing." Eli rose slowly, his face unreadable. Around him the crowd grew silent, the full weight of the betrayal settling in like dust after battle. The fight had never been about intimidation. It wasn't just a land grab, it was an attempted erasure. Now Eli knew exactly what he was facing, and he would burn their plans down to the last root. Morning came, not with peace, but with purpose. The sun crept up over the battered farmland, casting long shadows across the scorched edges of fences and singed grass from the night raid. The community was moving, not in panic, but in quiet coordination, repairing, reinforcing, regrouping. They had survived, yes, but survival was not the end goal anymore. Not after what had been confessed in the dark. Eli stood at the center of the barn, now transformed into a war room. Maps were pinned to wooden beams, radio batteries recharging on the workbench, and Naomi's laptop open beside a stack of audio recorders and legal documents. The footage she had captured of the confession was queued and ready. The town had looked the other way for too long. That time was over. Naomi adjusted her microphone and began the upload. The video went live by mid-morning. It wasn't just a clip of hooded men tied to fence posts or smoke rising from the edge of town. It was a man confessing that the Red Thorns were attempting to cleanse the black community under the protection of Sheriff Gentry Cobb. It was a declaration, on record, that the violence had never been about property, but legacy, identity, and fear. It was evidence that reached beyond the farm fields, past the town lines, and into living rooms across the county. By midday, the whispers had begun. Some white residents watched from behind half-closed blinds, the weight of complicity settling into their chests like a heavy stone. Others gathered at the gas station and diner, muttering about exaggerations and outsiders stirring up trouble. But a few, teachers, shopkeepers, and older war veterans, stood silent and ashamed, unable to deny what they had seen and heard with their own eyes. The town had been infected by something long festering. Now it had a name and a face. Eli didn't wait to see how the town would react. He had other plans. Under the cover of dusk, while the town argued with itself, Eli led a small group of trained community members along an old hunting trail that curved through the hills north of town. Land that had been left fallow for years, until Caleb Knox claimed it for himself. It was where the Red Thorns stored their weapons and met in secret, surrounded by brush and thick pine woods. It was their stronghold, their armory, and it was time to dismantle it. Eli moved with military precision, crouched low, issuing silent hand signals to those behind him. Micah was with him, along with two others, men who had fought in wars abroad and had returned to farms and welding shops before this war found them again. They reached the outer edge of the compound, camouflaged tents barely visible through the trees. Two men patrolled with flashlights, speaking in hushed tones, but they weren't alert. They were growing careless, assuming the people they had terrorized would never take the fight to their doorstep. Eli gave the signal. The team split into pairs. One team moved to disable the vehicles. Tires were slashed in coordinated silence, spark plugs quietly removed. The other team moved on the weapons cache. A converted tool shed fortified with a padlock. Eli approached it himself, cutting the lock with a bolt cutter and entering without hesitation. Inside were crates, some labeled as farming equipment, others with no markings at all. Eli opened the first and found exactly what he'd expected: ammunition, machetes, and modified rifles. He placed a timed incendiary charge at the base of the shed, covered it with a loose tarp, and backed out without a sound. Eli's hand rested briefly on the tarp-covered crate, his eyes sweeping over the dark interior of the shed one final time. The incendiary charge blinked softly, its quiet red light pulsing like a warning heartbeat against the rough wood. Around him, the silence hummed with tension. Every second mattered. Every breath had to be calculated. He slipped out of the shed just as two more red thorns, older men with rifles slung carelessly across their backs, emerged from the tree line. One of them lit a cigarette, chuckling to himself, utterly unaware that the entire operation was seconds from falling apart. Eli pressed himself against the outer wall of the shed, waiting. His hand hovered just above the knife strapped to his thigh, not from panic, but from reflex, the calm preparation of someone who'd moved through worse nights in worse countries. The cigarette smoker turned his back. The second man bent to tie his boot. Eli struck. He moved low and silent, grabbing the first man by the back of the collar and slamming him face first into the shed wall. The impact knocked the air out of him, and the cigarette flew into the grass, still lit. Before the second man could rise, Eli swept his legs from under him, then dropped a heavy elbow to his chest, silencing him with a single breathless thud. A flash of movement to the left. Another patrol had spotted the scuffle. Two men sprinted forward, shouting. One raised a weapon. Eli ducked behind a tree, drawing the knife from his belt and flinging it toward the gunman's shoulder. It landed with a thud, sending him sprawling sideways with a scream. The other kept coming. Micah intercepted him. The teen moved fast, dropping low as the red thorn charged, trying to body him down. Micah twisted at the last moment, grabbing the man's jacket and using his own momentum to send him flying into a pile of rusted barrels. The sound echoed like thunder. A second later, the attacker tried to rise, but Micah was already on him, driving a knee into his gut and elbowing him across the jaw. The man collapsed, groaning. Eli caught Micah's eye. No need for words, just a nod. Behind them, shouts rang out across the camp. More gang members were emerging, drawn by the noise. Eli's second team, 3 older men and a former army ranger named Isaiah, fanned out through the brush, flanking the tents. The element of surprise was shrinking. They needed to move fast. The vehicle crew had already done their job. Engines disabled, tires slit, spark plugs pocketed. Several trucks sat crooked and lifeless near the tree line, their owners none the wiser yet. One of the red thorns, taller, broad-chested and snarling, burst from the main tent with a crowbar in hand. He locked eyes with Eli and charged. Eli dropped low as the first swing whistled over his head. The second came quicker, aimed at his ribs. He caught the shaft mid-swing and stepped in, elbowing the man's throat and slamming a boot into his shin. The gang member buckled but didn't fall. He roared and tried to grapple, but Eli had already spun behind him, locking an arm around his neck and pulling tight. The man thrashed wildly, slamming his elbows back, one grazing Eli's ribs. But it wasn't enough. Seconds later, the thug went limp and dropped to the dirt. From behind a tent, another man lunged with a hunting knife. He didn't see Isaiah coming until it was too late. The veteran tackled him mid-sprint, twisting the knife out of his grip and delivering 2 precise punches to the man's face, sending him into the grass unconscious. The camp was waking now, fully. Dozens of red thorns spilled from tents, some shouting for weapons, others running without direction, clearly rattled, but there was no order, no command. That was the difference. Eli's team was coordinated. They moved like clockwork, signaling silently, watching flanks, covering each other. The Red Thorns panicked like men expecting obedience, not resistance. From the ridge above the camp, a small figure waved. A lookout teen with a clear line of sight on the shed, his signal. 7 fingers up, then a fist. 3 minutes until detonation. Eli tapped his radio once. Fall back. Leave the rest. They began retreating into the woods, every step precise, leaving confusion behind. One man tried to follow Micah, barefoot, wild-eyed, but Isaiah looped back, grabbed a branch from the ground, and swung it hard enough to send the man tumbling. Micah reached the ridge with Eli just behind him. They crouched behind a felled log, looking down at the compound now swirling in chaos. Flashlights waved in every direction, men shouting questions, others barking contradictory orders. They'd found the unconscious bodies. Someone screamed for a medic. Then the shed door opened. One of the gang's leaders, recognizable by the rifle strapped across his chest and the arrogance in his walk, stepped into the now empty weapons cache. He froze, looked around, took a step inside. Then came the first click, followed by the blink of red light. And then, boom! The shed erupted in a contained column of fire, lifting a pillar of smoke and flame high into the night sky. The explosion shook the hillside, rattling leaves and echoing down into the valley. Ammunition inside began to cook off in short bursts. Pop, pop, pop. Rattling like distant fireworks. The Red Thorns screamed and dove for cover. Some fled into the trees. Others threw themselves behind trucks that wouldn't start. A few just dropped to their knees, stunned. Eli and Micah watched from the ridge as fire consumed the heart of the gang's supply line. Their weapons cache was gone. Their trucks were useless. Their confidence shattered. Micah whispered, "We did it." Eli kept his eyes on the flames, his voice low. "No, we just took away their teeth. They'll come back biting. But we'll be ready," Micah said. Eli finally looked at him. "We already are." The fire raged behind them, smoke rising like a signal in the sky, a warning that the days of fear were over. By the time the gang reached the blaze, the defenders were long gone, melted into the trees like smoke themselves, silent, unseen, and stronger than ever. The fight had shifted. This was no longer a defense. This was a reckoning. Back at the farm, Clara had been preparing supplies for the next patrol run, moving carefully through the pantry when she heard the screen door creak open. She turned and saw a shadow step into the hall. Tall, broad, wearing a red bandana over his mouth. Before she could scream, a second figure emerged from the back entrance, blocking her path to the kitchen. The Red Thorns had come for her. Clara didn't panic. She moved slowly, hands raised, speaking calmly. "You don't have to do this." One man stepped forward, eyes wild. "He brought this on himself. Should have sold. Should have stayed quiet." "I'm not afraid of you," Clara said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. As the man reached for her, a sharp whistle cut through the air. From the rafters, a figure dropped, barely more than a shadow, and landed squarely on the back of the nearest attacker. It was Jalen, a 17-year-old who had grown up riding horses and learning fieldcraft from Eli. He fought like he'd been waiting for this moment, jabbing the man's ribs and knocking the weapon from his hand. Clara, without hesitation, grabbed a heavy iron pan and turned to the second attacker, swinging hard and striking him across the shoulder. The man collapsed, groaning. By the time Eli and the others returned, breathless and bloodied from their strike, the two men were bound and lying on the porch. Clara stood beside them, chin lifted. "They tried," she said simply. "But they didn't get far." Eli walked over, kneeling beside Jalen. "You saved her." Jalen looked up, eyes fierce. "You said protect the heart of the community." "And you did," Eli said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Perfectly." The failed attack on Clara rippled through the town. The line had been crossed. No longer farms and fences, but wives and mothers. Even those who had remained on the fence began to shift. The red thorns had exposed themselves not as guardians of tradition, but as violent extremists willing to harm anyone to protect a lie. The gang, once confident and emboldened, began to fracture. Some disappeared overnight, their trucks gone by morning, their homes abandoned. Others stayed and tried to double down, but they found themselves isolated, surrounded by a growing wall of shame and resistance. And for the first time, the community didn't whisper in fear. They stood and spoke openly. Clara, Naomi, Pastor Roy, and even quiet Miss Liza took to the pulpit and street corners, reminding the town of its history. Not just the pain, but the pride. Not just survival, but endurance. Eli didn't need to rally them anymore. They were rallying each other. And behind it all, Eli's leadership was no longer just respected. It was trusted. He had trained farmers into guardians. He had turned fear into fire. And now the community had become something more than a cluster of homes. It had become a force. The wind shifted just before sunrise, sweeping in from the ridge with a sharpness that seemed to whisper of something coming, something inevitable. It moved swiftly through the corn rows, flattening them with urgency, and carried with it the unmistakable scent Eli had known far too well in his previous life. Oil, sweat, gasoline, and gunpowder. He stood on the porch with his back straight, rifle slung across his shoulder, his gaze steady on the horizon, where headlights were gathering like a rising tide. Clara came up behind him, silent in her steps, resting a hand on his shoulder, with the quiet understanding of a woman who had stood beside a warrior long before this war had begun. "You knew it would come to this," she said softly. Eli gave a slow nod, jaw clenched, eyes still fixed on the gathering storm in the distance. They've lost everything but their pride. That makes them reckless. That makes them desperate. The handheld radio on his hip crackled, and Micah's voice came through in a low, urgent tone. "We count 8 trucks, Eli. They're loaded heavy. 30 men, maybe more. Spreading out fast." Eli lifted the radio and spoke with calm certainty. Phase 3. Let them come in deep. Do not engage until the signal. All across the farmland, the town moved into position with a quiet efficiency that had not existed just weeks ago. They weren't an unarmed, panicked group anymore. They were watchful, prepared. Their hands held tools and makeshift weapons, but their hearts held something more powerful than rage, resolve. Pastor Roy stood near the churchyard, gripping a hammer in one hand and a heavy wooden bat in the other. Naomi knelt on the rooftop of the general store, with her camera balanced and ready beside a slingshot and a bag of glass marbles. Teenagers crouched in high grass and behind hay bales, their eyes sharp and ears trained to the rustle of boots on soil. The red thorns came in waves. Their trucks roared through the soft earth, engines revving like beasts eager to strike. Men poured out of them in black clothes, tactical vests, shouting orders that didn't align, their movements swift but undisciplined. Some wore masks, others didn't bother. They had come for a final strike, and they wanted to be seen. But Eli didn't run. He waited just beyond the main fence line with his staff in one hand and a knife sheathed at his side. He had removed the rifle from his back because this was not a moment for bullets. This was a moment for truth. He wanted them to see what they could not defeat. The first wave rushed the gate and walked straight into a trap laid with surgical precision. As they stepped through the opening, a line of concealed powder traps ignited in a controlled burst, releasing clouds of crushed lime, black pepper, and dried nettles into the air. The mixture scalded eyes, choked lungs, and left men stumbling and clawing at their faces. From the shadows of the hay bales, Micah's unit emerged with swift coordination, moving like the very wind they had trained beneath. They didn't hesitate. They disarmed the coughing, blinded attackers with quick blows, disabling limbs without ending lives. Wooden staffs cracked against shoulders, knees buckled, and within seconds, A quarter of the gang was down, humiliated before they had even fired a shot. On the far side of the property, near the Taylor farmhouse, a separate group of red thorns met resistance they had not expected. A simple barn, reinforced by strategy and resolve, became an impenetrable wall. Teens dropped sandbags from rafters. Women hurled smoke bombs from hidden windows. The gang tried to advance, but they found themselves moving through a maze of confusion and ambushes. Each step forward met with resistance. Gunfire cracked from a higher ridge as one of the trucks tried to circle and flank the defenders. But the vehicle never made it far. Its front wheels dropped into a trench dug deep and hidden by brush. Metal screamed as the axle snapped. Men leapt out of the crippled truck and scattered. But they were met by Isaiah and two others, who fought with the brutal clarity of men who had seen war and survived it. In the center of the farm, Eli became motion. He didn't wait for attackers to come to him. He moved with purpose, gliding across dirt with the grace of a trained fighter. A man rushed at him with a crowbar raised high. Eli stepped inside the arc of the swing, caught the man's wrist, and slammed his forearm down until bone cracked. Another came from behind, reaching for his neck. Eli bent low, grabbed the man's leg, and sent him crashing backward, breathless and stunned. A chain whipped across Eli's back, ripping through his shirt. He stumbled, pain roaring through his side. But only for a moment. He turned sharply, caught the chain mid-swing, yanked hard, and drove his knee into the attacker's ribs. The man dropped to the ground, gasping and groaning. Then, from the rising smoke and noise, a voice rang out, louder than the others, familiar, hateful. "Briggs!" Caleb Knox appeared, stepping through the chaos like a devil walking through a house on fire. He wore a black jacket, his holster fastened tight at his side. His face was red with fury, and his eyes gleamed with something unhinged. "You think you've won?" Caleb roared. "You think this little rebellion makes you something more than what you are? This land was never yours." Eli turned toward him, wiping the blood from his cheek with the back of his arm. "This land was worked by our hands. It was passed down through our blood. You don't get to rewrite that. You should have taken the offer." Caleb spat, drawing his pistol. "You should have walked away like your kind always do." Eli stepped closer, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. "You never gave an offer. You gave a threat. Now I'm giving you one." Caleb raised the gun. Eli didn't flinch. "I don't need a weapon to beat you," Eli said. "But if you squeeze that trigger, you won't leave this ground standing." The doubt flashed in Caleb's eyes. Just enough. Eli moved. He closed the space between them in 3 quick strides, striking Caleb's wrist before the gun could level. The weapon flew from his grip and clattered against a stone. The 2 men crashed into the dirt, fists flying, elbows cutting through the air with rage and precision. Around them, the crowd of defenders and gang fighters instinctively formed a wide circle. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was the reckoning. Caleb struck first, wide and wild. Eli ducked under the swing, drove his fist into Caleb's ribs, then caught him behind the head and dragged him into his knee. Caleb reeled back, but didn't fall. He roared like an animal and lunged, tackling Eli to the ground. They rolled, each trying to gain control. Caleb hammered a fist into Eli's ribs again and again. Eli gritted his teeth, turned into the assault, and locked Caleb's arm in a twist, forcing him onto his back. Blood poured from both their faces, but neither man slowed. They fought like 2 storms colliding. Raw, brutal, unwilling to yield. Caleb broke free with a surge of rage and landed a clean punch to Eli's temple. Eli staggered, blinking away stars. But as Caleb lunged for the finishing blow, Eli caught him, twisted his momentum, and slammed him hard into the earth. The air left Caleb's lungs in a single ragged gasp. Eli stood over him, breathing heavy, bleeding, but unbroken. "You want the land?" he said, voice hoarse. "You'll have to bleed into it like we did." Caleb groaned, trying to rise, but Eli didn't let him. With one final strike, a hard, sharp elbow across the jaw, Caleb Knox dropped limp, his fight broken, his pride buried in the dirt. Eli stood alone, fists clenched, chest heaving, the sky behind him burning in the colors of a coming dawn. The town had watched. Now the war was theirs to finish. Caleb Knox lay sprawled in the dirt, blood trickling from his mouth as he gasped for air, his fists twitching uselessly at his sides. Eli stood over him, chest rising and falling with the weight of the battle, his muscles burning from the long fight, but his focus razor sharp. The sun had begun to rise in streaks of orange and red behind him, casting long shadows across the scorched earth. Around them, the last of the red thorns were still clashing with the townspeople in scattered bursts of violence. Cries, thuds, and shouts echoed across the fields, but they were growing fewer, weaker, like a storm slowly breaking apart. Just as Eli turned his head to assess the rest of the battlefield, a sudden roar of an engine pierced through the noise. A large pickup truck, its windows reinforced and tailgate removed for cargo, barreled through the far tree line with alarming speed. 3 more gang members stood upright in the truck bed, armed with metal poles, swinging them wildly as they approached. "They're flanking the orchard!" Naomi's voice crackled through the radio clipped to Eli's belt, urgency threading every word. "They're trying to break through the west side." Eli didn't hesitate. He took off running, cutting across the dirt like a man possessed, leaping over fallen debris and ducking beneath snapped tree branches. Every step jarred his aching body, but the pain only reminded him what was at stake. As he reached the western fence, he saw them. 5 community members, including Clara and Jalen, trying to push carts and fencing to block the path. But it was too late. The truck burst through the barrier with a screech of twisted metal and came to a jerking halt. The 3 men in the back jumped down immediately, rushing toward the defenders. One of them made a beeline for Clara, swinging a crowbar with deadly intent. Eli's heart pounded in his ears as he picked up speed. Clara ducked just in time, the crowbar slicing through the air above her head. Jalen reacted without hesitation, stepping in between and swinging the butt of his shovel into the attacker's chest. The blow landed, but not hard enough to stop him. The man recovered and shoved Jalen aside, raising his weapon again. That's when Eli reached them. He slammed into the attacker with his full weight, shoulder driving into the man's sternum like a battering ram. They both hit the ground, rolling through the grass, but Eli came out on top. He grabbed the crowbar and wrenched it free, then struck the man's arm hard enough to make the bone snap with a sickening pop. The attacker screamed, and Eli shoved him face first into the dirt, where he didn't rise again. Another gang member charged at Jalen, but the boy was ready this time. He blocked the swing with his forearm, grimaced at the impact, then buried his knee into the man's thigh, sending him stumbling. Eli grabbed the man by the collar, yanked him backward, and drove a punishing elbow into the side of his jaw. The man went limp, his body crumpling. The final attacker from the truck pulled out a small pistol from inside his jacket. Shaking, uncertain, but desperate, Eli stood slowly, positioning himself in front of Clara, one hand subtly reaching for the knife on his belt. The man's hands trembled as he pointed the weapon. "Back off!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You back off, or I swear—" "You're already losing," Eli said steadily, his voice calm and low. "Put the gun down. Walk away. You don't want to go where this ends." But the man didn't listen. He took one step forward. That was all Eli needed. He dropped low, spun on the ball of his foot, and hurled the knife from his belt with a single fluid motion. The blade sailed through the air and struck the man's hand with a clean, bone-deep thud. The pistol flew from his grasp as he screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his bleeding wrist. Clara stepped past Eli, her hand still gripping the tool she had used to defend herself, and looked the man square in the face. "You came into our home with fire," she said, "but you're the ones who'll burn." Eli took a breath, letting the surge of adrenaline fade just enough to refocus. He moved from the orchard edge back toward the central field, where the last of the fighting had begun to dwindle. Bodies, wounded, dazed, and disarmed, were scattered across the field. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader unconscious and their final push crushed, began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Some tried to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The townspeople had encircled them, shoulder to shoulder, forming a living wall. Pastor Roy stood at the head of the line, flanked by old Miss Liza, and 3 teenagers who had never picked up a weapon before this war, yet now stood unwavering, like stone. Naomi descended from the store rooftop, camera still rolling. "It's over," she said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "The whole town saw it. The whole world will see it." Eli found Caleb again, barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open as the light returned to the sky. Eli crouched beside him. "You lost," he said, his voice like iron cooled in water. "Not just the fight. You lost the lie. You thought you could erase people by fear, but you couldn't even hold your own ground." Caleb coughed, blood in his mouth. We built this town." Eli shook his head. "You stained it. But we're the ones who will rebuild it." From the ridge, the distant wail of sirens could be heard at last. Real ones. Not those that looked the other way, not Cobb's. These were from outside the county, summoned by Naomi's uploads and the evidence of a community that refused to vanish. The sirens drew closer, growing louder with each rotation of their rising wail. Dust swirled along the dirt road as a caravan of state patrol cruisers, marked and unmarked, descended into the valley from the northern ridge. For the first time in what felt like a century, the lights that flashed across Eli's land were not the weapons of oppression, but the signals of consequence. As the vehicles came to a stop and their doors opened in synchronized clunks, Sheriff Gentry Cobb stood motionless near the gate, watching the arrival with a face stripped of authority. His uniform was torn at the collar, his badge still glinting in the morning sun. But his stance betrayed the truth. He no longer commanded fear, and the weight of what he'd allowed had finally come crashing down. A state officer approached him, one hand resting near his holster. "Sheriff Cobb," he called out, his voice even, "you are being placed under investigation by the state. We have video, documents, confessions. Step forward slowly and place your hands where I can see them." Cobb looked around at the faces gathering. Black residents he had ignored, disrespected, and endangered. They were watching now, not with vengeance in their eyes, but something far worse for a man like him. Justice. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent and resolute, backs straight, chins raised. Miss Liza, standing with her cane and her Sunday coat, despite the smoke still lingering in the air. Pastor Roy, his shirt bloodied, but his hands steady. Jalen, face bruised, but gaze unwavering. Cobb's hand hovered over his gun, but he didn't draw it. He turned instead, slowly at first, then breaking into a full run, through the smoke, past the scorched tree line, and into the woods beyond. But he didn't make it far. A second patrol unit broke off in pursuit, the crackle of radios and the pounding of boots echoing into the trees behind him. No one from the community moved to chase him. They didn't need to. Cobb was finished. His escape, if anything, was a final pitiful act of a man who had lived too long on borrowed power. Whatever came next for him would be decided by people who answered to laws, not legacies. Eli turned back toward the field. The final flames were dying down, leaving behind trails of ash curling into the golden light. The barn had smoke curling from its rafters, and the fencing on the southern stretch was blackened and broken. The soil bore the marks of combat, boot prints, tire tracks, bloodstains, but the land still stood, and so did its people. The battle for the farm had ended, but the war was not yet over. The smoldering wreckage left behind by the red thorns had scorched more than just fences and fields. It had blackened the reputation of a town and revealed rot in the roots of institutions that were supposed to protect. Though Caleb Knox had been taken away in handcuffs and Sheriff Cobb had fled into the forest only to be caught 2 miles outside the county line, Eli Briggs knew better than to believe that justice ended in arrests. A network like the Red Thorns didn't grow in the dark without nourishment. It had help. From money, from silence, from people in high places. Eli didn't wait for others to go looking. He picked up the trail himself. With the discipline and methodical patience of a man who had tracked warlords through foreign jungles and insurgents across burned-out cities, Eli began piecing together the trail left behind. With the discipline and methodical patience of a man who had tracked warlords through foreign jungles and insurgents across burned-out cities, Eli began piecing together the trail left behind. He went through every document Naomi had collected, rewatched every clip, every confession. Then he started making visits. Quietly, directly, without cameras or attention. He went to storage lots and construction trailers tied to Caleb's real estate company. He spoke to former associates, some of whom had disappeared after the fire. He walked through abandoned silos, shuttered factories, and barns that had served as backroom deal rooms. He uncovered folders stuffed in crawl spaces, hard drives hidden under floorboards, accounts disguised under false LLCs in the names of distant cousins and shell companies. All of it painted a picture far larger than one gang of racist thugs. Caleb had been backed by donors, small-time politicians, business owners, and 2 members of the county zoning board. They weren't just enabling the violence. They were funding it. They had planned to turn the cleared black farmland into a private industrial estate, something they could profit from while scrubbing away the people who had lived there for generations. Eli brought everything: documents, financial records, hidden camera footage, to the state attorney's office in a battered duffel bag. He walked in with a quiet nod to the clerk and waited in the lobby until a suited man with gray hair and guarded eyes stepped out to meet him. "You're Elijah Briggs?" the attorney asked. Eli nodded. "Everything you need to bring them down is in that bag." The attorney eyed it warily. "Do you know what you're handing me?" Eli met his gaze with unflinching calm. The truth, and a choice. The story hit the headlines 3 days later. Naomi's article, titled "The Fire They Started," spread like wildfire. Her footage of the final standoff was edited together with confession tapes and historical context. How the black farmers of the valley had built the land, fought for every acre, and were nearly erased in silence. News anchors called it the story of a small-town reckoning. Social media exploded. Protests sparked across neighboring counties. Civil rights organizations demanded sweeping investigations into the state's oversight. And, in a swift, unprecedented move, the Department of Homeland Security formally branded the Red Thorns as a domestic terror group. What followed was swift and precise. Dozens of arrests were made within the month. Some men were pulled from cabins in the hills, others from strip malls and car dealerships. Those who had once strutted through the valley with hate on their breath were marched into vans in handcuffs, their faces pale with the weight of consequences they'd never thought would come. The state launched formal proceedings against the corrupt officials who had fed the fire in silence. The judge recused from Caleb's first hearing was replaced by a federal magistrate. The courtroom was packed the day of sentencing. Eli was there. He didn't testify. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He sat in the second row, his suit plain and unadorned, hands folded calmly in his lap. He watched as Caleb Knox, flanked by his trembling lawyer, was sentenced to 25 years without parole for conspiracy to commit hate crimes, incitement of terrorism, and attempted murder. Caleb never looked in Eli's direction, but Eli watched him. Not with hatred, not with triumph, with finality. When the judge's gavel struck the bench, Eli stood and walked out of the courtroom without a word. He returned home that same evening as the sun dipped below the hills. Clara was waiting on the porch, with a cup of coffee and a blanket folded across her lap. Jalen was hammering a new fence post in the southern field. Pastor Roy's choir could be heard faintly from the church down the road, rehearsing something slow, steady, and rising. Eli stepped onto the porch, removed his jacket, and let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Is it done?" Clara asked softly, handing him the coffee. "It is," Eli replied, his voice low. "They'll never touch this place again." Clara looked out toward the fields where new crops had already begun to rise. "You think we'll ever forget it?" "No," Eli said, sitting beside her. "But that's not the point. We remember. So we never go back." And in the quiet that followed, they sat together, the fireflies beginning their dance across the dusk, the land breathing again beneath their feet. The fight was over, but the roots remained. Months passed. Winter gave way to the gentle green of spring, and in the soft thaw of the valley soil, something deeper took root than the crops that slowly rose in rows, something resilient, something earned. The land that had once been scarred by tire tracks and blood now bore signs of healing. The fences had been mended, the barns rebuilt, the fields plowed clean of soot and ash. But what truly stood as a testament to the victory was not what Eli Briggs had restored alone. It was what the people had done together. The farmhouse, once ringed by broken boards and blackened earth, now stood tall again, painted in fresh white, its porch sanded and sealed, the wooden beams carved with initials, marks left by neighbors who had come with tools, lumber, food, and strength. Some had come quietly, unsure if they were welcome after the silence of before, but they were not turned away, because Eli had made it clear. The ones who showed up now, who came not to erase the past, but to build a better future, would always have a place here. The rebuilding was slow, deliberate. They didn't rush it. There was meaning in every nail driven, every patch of field retilled. Men who had once nodded politely in passing now stood side by side at the lumber pile. Women shared recipes and replaced shattered windows together. Children who had once played only within the limits of their yards now raced between the houses, laughing like they were writing a new history with each step. Some scars remained, of course. The land kept its memory. In places where fire had blackened the soil, grass came back stubbornly. There were nights when the older folks still woke at the sound of a car engine in the dark. But the fear had loosened its grip, and what stood in its place was something even stronger than safety: unity. At the center of the community's transformation stood a simple brick structure with high windows and a wide front porch. It had once been the remnants of the old feed store. Now, thanks to Clara Briggs and a coalition of local educators, it had become the heart of the valley, the Clara Briggs Schoolhouse for Community Learning. Here, children of every background learned side by side. They studied the history of their land, not the one written in state textbooks, but the one whispered through generations, passed down in stories of resistance, patience, and dignity. Clara taught literacy to adults in the evenings. On weekends, she hosted gatherings where elders told their stories while Naomi recorded every word, ensuring the truth was never buried again. Naomi's work had not gone unnoticed. Her investigative series, Iron Roots: The Fight for Hollow Bend, had won her the National Journalism Integrity Award. She had accepted it in a modest black dress, standing beneath bright lights in a hall filled with power and press, but her voice remained grounded. "This story was never about me," she said, as the applause died down. "It was about the people who stood when it would have been easier to fall. I was just lucky enough to witness them." Micah, now 18, had made his decision just after the trial ended. He stood at the edge of the field one evening, beside Eli, both of them watching the first stars emerge. "I'm joining the military," he said simply. "Not because I want to fight, but because I want to protect. You taught me that." Eli looked at the boy, who had once stood behind him in fear, who now looked him in the eye as an equal. "Then serve with honor," Eli said, "and never forget who you are or where you came from." Micah left that summer with a small bag and his grandmother's Bible tucked into his coat. The town held a gathering in his honor, and Eli led the prayer himself, his voice strong but his eyes quietly proud. In late autumn, when the fields were golden and the air smelled of dry leaves and earth, the community gathered for something different, something sacred. Near the northern fence, where once a burning cross had stood in the soil as a threat and a promise of hate, now the people gathered in silence as Eli knelt and dug his hands into the dirt. He planted a sapling, an oak tree, its roots already reaching down with confidence. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, then looked at the circle of faces around him. "We plant this tree," Eli said, "not to forget what happened, but to remember how we answered, with strength, with unity, with roots they couldn't burn." Beside the tree, a modest stone was placed. It bore no names, no dates, just a simple inscription: "We are still here." That evening, under lantern light and a harvest moon, the people of Hollow Bend shared food and stories around long tables. Music floated on the air. Laughter rose like smoke, and when the night cooled and the stars thickened above them, they stood in a long line to place their hands on the stone. Some prayed, some simply nodded. All knew what it meant. Later, as the crowd began to drift home, Clara walked over to Eli and slipped her hand into his. "Do you think we'll ever be at peace?" she asked. Eli looked out over the valley. Fields mended, homes rebuilt, children running barefoot in the grass, and felt something stir deep in his chest. Not pride, not triumph, but something humbler, something earned. "I think we're planting it," he said, "one root at a time." And as the night settled over Hollow Bend, the land stood quiet and whole, not because it had forgotten what it endured, but because the people upon it had remembered who they were. They were not victims. They were not refugees. They were home, and they would never be driven from it again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.